American Imperialism and the Spanish-American War. In this video, we will explore the notion of American imperialism and the causes and consequences of the Spanish-American War. Reasons for American imperialism. With the Industrial Revolution, the United States emerged as an industrial power and a world economic leader. To continue its economic expansion, the United States needed access to raw materials and markets to sell its industrial products. While European powers had colonial empires and were actively expanding and opening markets in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, the United States had only moderate access to these markets. The United States understood that to compete with European powers, they needed to grab territories while they were still available. The final collapse of the Spanish Empire provided a golden opportunity to acquire strategic territories. The United States had begun expanding since independence, and this new wave of expansion in other continents became a new manifest destiny. Borrowing from social Darwinist ideas, many Americans believe that Anglo-Saxons, or people of British ancestry, were superior and were destined to rule over others. To justify colonization, they used the idea of white mansburden, which claims that white men, especially Protestants of British descent, had a duty to spread civilization, democracy, religion, and culture throughout the world. The importance of naval power. In 1890, Captain ALFRED THAYER MAHAN published the most influential book in American imperialist theory. His book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, urged the United States to increase its wealth by developing a strong navy, obtaining a large fleet of merchant ships, and holding overseas colonies. Mahan recommended building a canal through Panama, developing trade with Asia, and annexing colonies in the Pacific and the Caribbean to serve as military bases and coaling stations. All of these ideas would guide U.S. foreign policy at the beginning of the 20th century, especially during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. The Anti-Imperialist League. Not everyone supported imperialism. Anti-imperialists believed that American rule over other nations was immoral and against the American values of democracy and self-determination. Members of the Anti-Imperialist League included writer Mark Twain, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, labor leader Samuel Gompers, activist Jane Addams, and former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. The Spanish-American War. The Spanish Empire had been in decline since the beginning of the 19th century. By 1898, all that remained of the once great Spanish Empire was Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and other small possessions. In 1891, Cuban revolutionary José Martí organized a rebellion while in exile in the United States. Martí gathered support from Cuban cigar makers in Ybor City, in Tampa, and returned to Cuba to fight for independence. Martí was killed 1 month later. The rebellion continued after Martí's death, but was met with harsh opposition and brutal suppression from Spain. Cuban peasants were forced into concentration camps, surrounded by barbed wire, to separate them from the rebels. Both sides committed terrible atrocities. Up to this point, the war was a Cuban affair. But why did the United States enter the war? Let's look at some important factors and events that led to American intervention. Economic and political interests. You may recall from a previous video, the Ostend Manifesto. Before the Civil War, Southerners were especially interested in buying Cuba from Spain to to balance the number of free and slave states. The transaction never happened due to strong northern opposition. The crisis in Cuba seemed like the best opportunity for the United States to obtain the island from Spain. Additionally, American investors in Cuba were also pressing for American intervention and protection of their business interests in the island. Yellow journalism. As the American public learned about the concentration camps and other atrocities of war, many felt a moral obligation to intervene in Cuba. Newspapers in the United States used yellow journalism or yellow press, a technique to sell more newspapers by using sensationalism and even distorting events to arouse more interest and sympathy. The main newspapers, Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal, deliberately distorted news from Cuba. Spaniards were depicted as murderous brutes, and Cuban rebels as helpless victims. Even fictitious accounts of war atrocities were published, giving Americans inaccurate information of the situation in Cuba and pushing the public opinion to favor intervention. The Delomé letter. A letter from Enrique Dupuy Delomé, the Spanish ambassador to the United States, was intercepted and published by the Hearst Press. In his letter, Delomé called President McKinley weak and revealed that Spain had not been completely transparent in its negotiations with the United States. The letter caused a public outcry. The explosion of the USS Maine. The American battleship USS Maine had been sent to Havana Harbor to protect American lives and property. Just a few days after the Delomé affair, the USS Maine exploded and sank. Immediately, the yellow press blamed Spain for the explosion, raising a public outcry for war. McKinley demanded an immediate ceasefire and independence for Cuba. Spain refused. With the American public supporting an intervention, President McKinley asked Congress to declare war on Spain. The Spanish-American War only lasted 4 months. The U.S. Navy's technological superiority ensured victory for the United States. Theodore Roosevelt, an assistant secretary in the Navy at the time, resigned his post and gathered a group of volunteers to fight in the war. The Rough Riders, as the volunteers were called, fought in several battles under Roosevelt's command, including a decisive win in the famous San Juan Hill Battle. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and occupied the Philippines. Spain was defeated and lost its colonies in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. The United States annexed all of these territories except Cuba. The Teller Amendment. When President McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war, Congress passed the Teller Amendment as a condition for that declaration. The Teller Amendment ensured that the U.S. would grant Cuba its independence once Spain was defeated. Essentially, the United States promised not to annex Cuba as a territory. American forces remained stationed in Cuba, and the island became a virtual U.S. protectorate under American protection and control. The Platt Amendment. In 1901, Congress replaced the Teller Amendment with the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment laid out the conditions for withdrawal of American troops from Cuba. Cubans were forced to accept the Platt Amendment, which was integrated into the Cuban Constitution. As part of the agreement, Cuba would allow the U.S. to set up naval bases in its territory. In addition, Cuba could not borrow money from foreign countries unless it could repay it, and the United States kept the right to intervene in Cuban foreign affairs whenever it was necessary. American occupation benefited Cuba in some ways, as it saw improvements in education and sanitation, as well as a constant inflow of American investments. Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico were annexed by the United States. In the Philippines, the U.S. faced resistance by Emilio Aguinaldo and his rebels until 1902. The United States improved conditions and promised to eventually grant Filipinos their independence. Guam and Puerto Rico are still United States territories. In 1952, Puerto Rico became a self-governing commonwealth, with the United States providing for its defense and foreign policy.